So as fans of professional wrestling, I'm sure we've all encountered those instances where someone would ask you the timeless question of, it's fake, right? Now, for the most part, it never really bothered me because I was never going to allow someone to dictate what I enjoyed watching as entertainment. And although I may not agree with their sentiment or their opinion, I do ultimately think it's just a poor choice of words. You see, instead of the word fake, perhaps stage or scripted would be much more appropriate in this sense. Professional wrestling is as physical as it gets, and it requires each participant to be at the top of their A game, entrusting their bodies with those around them. Injuries are a part of the business, and some of them are more severe than others. That's why in today's video, I'll be discussing 10 times that real-life injuries occurred in a wrestling match. What's going on, wrestling fans? My name is Jose Ramos Jr. Welcome back to the channel, and if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe in order to keep up to date with all the pro wrestling content that is produced here. That would include my weekly podcast, The J Area, where I discuss some of the top storylines of professional wrestling, as well as the post-show reactions to Monday Night Raw and Friday Night SmackDown, and other unique videos such as this one right here. So it's like I mentioned, injuries are a big part of professional wrestling, for better or for worse, and some of them are a little bit more memorable than others. Obviously, the first one I do want to talk about has a little bit of a personal bias to me. I remember it was the year 2006. The event was Armageddon. It was a December pay-per-view exclusive to Friday Night SmackDown, and in this pay-per-view there was a fatal four-way match for the WWE Tag Team Championships. It was a match that would include the defending champions Paul London and Brian Kendrick defending their titles against the teams of Dave Taylor, William Regal, the Hardy Boys, and Eminem. Now, obviously, if you're a diehard professional wrestling fan like myself, you already know where I'm going with this. In a ladder match, there's a lot of elements, there's a lot of different variables that come into the matchup. Whether or not it's safe or not, that's up for debate. But when you have someone like the Hardys who are well versed in a ladder match, they have that experience, you would like to think that there's going to be a little bit of safety incorporated into this matchup. That would not end up being the case. There was a point in the matchup where Jeff Hardy and Matt Hardy are gaining the upper hand on the heel team of Eminem, which consisted of Johnny Nitro and Joey Mercury. At one point in the match, they were able to set up the ladders in a way that it seemed like a seesaw, almost like a teeter-totter type of structure. Matt Hardy would have his back up against the turnbuckles and would be holding the heads of Nitro and Mercury, having another ladder resting on top of another ladder, so that when Jeff Hardy were to jump off of the turnbuckle and land on one end of the ladder, the end closest to Eminem would lift up and hitting them in the face. The only issue is, in itself, that explanation would imply a little bit of danger, right? A little bit of misfortune would come in the way of Joey Mercury when Jeff Hardy would jump onto one end of the ladder, the other end elevated as planned. However, it connected with Joey Mercury in a way that I don't think anybody anticipated. Upon rewatching years later, it never gets easier to see the end result. The ladder would connect with Joey Mercury, resulting in a broken nose as well as a fractured orbital bone that essentially would cause him a little bit of part of his vision and would ultimately lead him to an early retirement. He did have a little short stint after this match and would have to wear one of those masks to protect his orbital bone, but the immediate aftermath of this injury is very gruesome. There was a lot of blood, a lot of swelling in the face of Joey Mercury to the point where he could not be recognized. It's certainly a memory that has stuck with me ever since I was a kid watching it, and it's actually a memory that a lot of members of my family, my mother included, who just simply cannot let go of that image of Joey Mercury and what had occurred in that ladder match. Moving on to another injury that had occurred way back when. This was an injury that I might not have watched live as a fan, but growing up it was a tale that was told as many a time whenever Mick Foley was involved in some kind of hardcore match. Mick Foley, under the name of Cactus Jack, was in a feud with Big Van Vader in WCW, and in the summer of 1994 they were on tour in Germany. These two had been at each other's throats. They were battling it out over the main event, and at one point during this matchup in Germany, they had done a hangman spot. So in this instant, we have Mick Foley being thrown out to the ring. However, he would catch himself in the top and middle rope, resulting in both ropes intertwining around his neck, holding him up on the apron again in a hangman position. The only thing is, prior to this event, I don't think it was known how tight these ropes were tightened, and when Mick Foley was placed in this hangman position, it was so tight that when he was able to finally free himself from that position, it would clip off part of his ear. Now, it wasn't completely torn off as the match would continue. It was then that Vader and Mick Foley, who would, trade off a couple of punches, and in the midst of the battle, then it would fall off. Mick Foley would lose part of his ear, which has become a huge part of the lore of Mick Foley and what he unfortunately endured as one of the top stars, not only in the WWE, but in pro wrestling, as he was always willing to sacrifice literal pieces of his body for the entertainment of the audience. We're going to stick in the year 1994, however, it won't be in WCW, rather it will be going to the Extreme Championship Wrestling, ECW. The event in question, November to Remember. Sabu and Chris Benoit were involved in a rivalry of their own, and what resulted is that they would main event the pay-per-view, November to Remember. However, early on in the matchup, Chris Benoit would lift Sabu in the air in what was intended to be a back body drop. Now, for those who aren't aware of a back body drop, this is where a wrestler were to lift up his opponent over his shoulder, causing him to rotate all the way over and landing on his back. The only issue in this instance is that Sabu was unable to get the proper rotation, and rather than landing on his back, he would land straight on his head, resulting in a broken neck. This was 2 minutes into a main event matchup. It had to be stopped. It resulted in the nickname for Chris Benoit, the Crippler. And like I said, Sabu would suffer a broken neck, a bit of nerve damage, and it ultimately would end his night, but it would not end his career, as he would eventually return to action literally 2 weeks later. Unfortunately, there are some wrestlers who are not lucky enough to suffer a neck injury and be able to return from said injury. As in the last couple of years, it was 2022, it was an episode of Friday Night SmackDown. Big E, one of the more beloved wrestlers on the roster, a beloved member of the New Day, a former WWE champion, Intercontinental champion, and tag team champion. He, again, would have a tag team match that involved himself and Ridge Holland. Ridge Holland would prepare to deliver a belly-to-belly overhead suplex to Big E, again, with the intention of Big E landing on his back. Unfortunately, they would not be able to gain enough rotation in this throw, and Big E would land again, straight on his head, breaking his neck, fracturing 2 different vertebrae, and resulting in what appears to be a career-ending neck injury. It's been 2 years since. A lot of speculation has been discussed whether or not he would be able to be cleared for a return, but Big E himself has said that doctors have provided their medical opinion and have said that it's probably best he does not return to the ring. Unfortunately, there was another individual who would suffer an injury that would end their career. It was Starrcade 1999. Bret the Hitman Hart would be taking on Goldberg in the main event for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. And again, another matchup that lives in infamy for pro wrestling and the lore that is Bret Hart versus Goldberg. If you know, Goldberg had rose to prominence very quickly at WCW, and in his height of his popularity, he would win the World Championship and feud with Bret the Hitman Hart. In this instance, though, there was a moment in the match where Goldberg reaches back and hits a mule kick on Bret the Hitman Hart. The only issue is he connected a little bit too snugly, a little bit too stiff, if you will, resulting in a concussion, causing Bret Hart to see stars and impair him for the remainder of the match. At the conclusion of the match, Bret Hart would be able to win and finish it off, but he would suffer from post-concussion syndrome, which would essentially end in the retirement of Bret Hart. He would not be the same, and some would say that Bret Hart still holds a little bit of resentment towards Goldberg ever since that injury all the way back in 1999. And speaking of Bret Hart and resentment, I would be remiss to not mention one of his greatest rivals, Shawn Michaels, who also suffered an injury that would basically cost him his career. The only difference is it wouldn't be a permanent career-ending injury, because back in 1998, the Royal Rumble event, Shawn Michaels was defending his WWE title against The Undertaker in a casket match, and in midway through the match, The Undertaker was going to throw Shawn Michaels over the ropes, over the casket as a big back body drop to the outside. The only issue was that Shawn Michaels, his lower back would connect with the casket, causing him a little bit of a breakage in his back. Now, when watching this back on the WWE Network or Peacock, wherever you watch, your WWE content, it's really quick. It's quick and you miss it. But it was just enough to connect, causing a lot of discomfort and pain that would result in Shawn Michaels missing 4.5 years of his career. He would leave at WrestleMania 14 in 1998 and would not return until SummerSlam 2002. It was at SummerSlam 2002 that Shawn Michaels would return to face his best friend, his DX partner in crime, Triple H, who was no stranger to injury himself. In fact, on an episode of Monday Night Raw in 2001, during a tag team match between Triple H and Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Chris Benoit and Chris Jericho, there was an instance where Chris Jericho had Steve Austin in the walls of Jericho, and as Triple H came over to break up the submission, he tore his left quadricep right off of the bone. And what was a freak accident that could not be explained, he would miss basically 9 months of his career, resulting in one of the biggest injuries and missed opportunities during that invasion angle. But it wouldn't be the only time that Triple H suffered a quadricep injury, because 6 years later, at New Year's Revolution 2007, in another tag team match that involved Triple H and Shawn Michaels versus Rated RKO, Triple H would then tore his right quadricep, and resulting in another 7 months absence. Looking back, I think this could simply be an instant where the left quadricep was able to heal and become stronger, leaving it to do a little bit of overcompensation and resulting in the injury of his right quadricep. Speaking of lower leg injuries, this next one is probably one of the more gruesome injuries ever seen in professional wrestling. I'm talking about WCW Sin 2001. It was the main event for the WCW Championship, as Psycho Sid, or Sid Vicious, was in a fatal 4-way match. Now, during this time, Sid wasn't really all around the greatest professional wrestling. There was some criticism that his offense was a bit limited, and those in WCW had suggested that he should expand his offensive attack. Some people would even suggest him coming off the top rope. Sid, though, recognizing his limitations, said, "Why should I, someone of my size, be coming off the top rope?" But he would do so in this matchup. Rather than the top rope, he settled for the middle rope, and he would jump off the middle rope, trying to strike his opponent with a big boot and landing on one foot. However, in this instant, on his left foot, he would land, and it would result in a breakage in his foot. He would break his tibia and his fibula, basically ending his normal career, ending his full-time career as a pro wrestler. This was a couple months before WCW was bought out by WWE, and it would be the last time we saw Sid on a major scale for quite some time. As you see, a lot of these injuries tend to be a little bit of a freak accident. You can't control them, and sometimes they just happen out of nowhere. But this next injury that occurred in 2015 on an episode of Monday Night Raw in July, Seth Rollins was battling against John Cena and would connect with John Cena's face with a running knee. The only thing is, you could really tell it connected by the end result. Now, upon getting hit in the face with a Seth Rollins knee, the camera begins to back out and we begin to see what John Cena's face looks like. Blood coming out of his nose, and if anything, just take a look at this picture. The disfigurement that was displayed on John Cena, it's not something that gets talked about a lot anymore, but I remember watching this on Monday Night Raw and seeing the internet go crazy over how his face was basically reconstructed for free on live television. To think this was the face of the company. People look at it with a broken nose and recognizing that this is the face representation of the WWE. But you want to talk about the face of a company. Back in early '97, it became apparent that the WWE was transitioning to a new attitude and they needed a new face for the company. That would eventually become Stone Cold Steve Austin, and he would have a match at SummerSlam of that year against Owen Hart for the Intercontinental Championship, and it has become one of the more infamous angles, one of the more infamous injuries in WWE history. Of course, I'm talking about the pile driver that Owen Hart would deliver to Austin. Unfortunately, Austin's head and neck were a little bit too close to the mat when receiving said maneuver. It would result in another neck injury that would help hamper Austin and essentially affect him for the rest of his career, causing him to retire in 2003. But of course, we will never know what it would have been like had Austin never gotten injured, because this injury resulted not only in a bruised spinal cord, but Stone Cold Steve Austin suffered brief paralysis during the match. Stone Cold Steve Austin is having to crawl his way back to Owen Hart in order to pin him. Now, many of fans who weren't aware of the angle back then wonder, why would Austin need to win? Why wouldn't Owen Hart just pin him right then and there and end the match? Well, because another added stipulation was that if Stone Cold were to lose this match, he would be forced to kiss the rear of Owen Hart. So having Owen Hart pin Stone Cold in the middle of the ring would force him having to kiss the derriere of Owen Hart. How would he do that if he was paralyzed at that moment? They had to call an audible and force a ugly roll-up and having Stone Cold win the match and essentially win the Intercontinental Championship as well. There are plenty of other injuries that I did not have the opportunity to share in this video, but please, if you can think of any other infamous injuries, please go ahead and comment down below some of the ones that stick out to you. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a like, subscribe to keep up to date with all the pro wrestling content, and as always, my name is Jose Ramos Jr. Thank you guys for enjoying this video, and I'll see you in the next one.